On November 18th, 2022, Pokemon Scarlet and Violet was finally released to the masses, and while a lot of folks were taking their time to get through the story and maybe even catch them all, a group of dedicated players known as Speedrunners wanted to take the game apart and master it. Scarlet and Violet having such an open and accessible world where you can do anything you want in any order was the perfect recipe for creative speedrun routes. But despite how fun these runs were, Scarlet and Violet is not a game that stood the test of time for speedrunners especially. And because of this, many of the folks who dedicated themselves to these games eventually just ran out of willpower to care about them after 2 years. 2 years to a speedrun is an eternity. Patches come and go, glitches can be found, but what never changes are speedrunners themselves. After all, these are people willing to start over at the very end of their runs when the smallest mistake cost them something big. To figure out why speedrunners ultimately gave up on Scarlet and Violet, I'm going to dissect each distinct era of the Scarlet and Violet speedrunning scene and piece together a story filled with hope, heartbreak, and a decent amount of community drama, starting from the very beginning of these runs all the way to the present day. When it comes to playing Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, performance has always been a big issue. But if great performance is what you're looking for, then look no further than today's sponsor from the amazing folks at Red Magic. Red Magic specializes in creating professional gaming equipment, tablets, and phones such as the incredible new Red Magic 10 Pro. I've admittedly been wanting a phone for a few years now, and when they sent me this monster, I was blown away by everything, including a freaking headphone jack on a phone in 2024. The Red Magic 10 Pro can probably even replace a PC with Snapdragon 8 Elite processor, 16 gigs of RAM, 512 gigs of storage, and a beautiful LED display of 1.5K resolution and a refresh rate of 144 Hz. Now, I know not everyone's the biggest mobile gamer, but the fact that you can play Pokemon Unite, Fortnite, Minecraft, or Honkai Star Rail with zero issues should speak volumes for the power of this thing. Also, are you seriously not entertained by this? I also need to stress that this thing's charging speed, battery life, and cooling fan are off the charts. And if you want to discover more, just reach out to Red Magic's cute anime girl virtual assistant, Mora, and she'll tell you how to customize this bad boy like I did. I'm literally gonna keep this phone forever, and if you want one for yourself, the price is the same as their old ones, but with an even more insane new model. Link for the Red Magic Pro will be in the description, and thanks again so much to Red Magic for this awesome sponsorship. Since the beginning of time, the main goal when first starting off a speedrun is to figure out how you can do an any percent speedrun. An any percent speedrun is defined as beating a game as fast as possible under any percentage of completion, which essentially amounts to clearing a game's story and reaching the credits. To reach Scarlet and Violet's credits, you need to clear out 3 entire storylines, every single battle, cutscene, and puzzle they provide. Then finally you can proceed into the final area of the game. But you'll still need to walk through this insanely huge crater, then win in some battles against multiple overpowered Pokemon before finally unlocking the credits. This entire sequence takes speedrunners about 5 hours and 20 minutes to get through it all, and I imagine you might be wondering why it takes that long. Well, there are 3 separate stories after all, and each of them having their own objectives doesn't really help either. Currently, it takes about 1 hour to clear the Path of Legend story, 1.5 hours to clear the Starfall Street story, and about 2 hours to beat the Victory Road story. Where a lot of this gets really hampered by time loss relates to the mechanics and shortcomings these games have for a speedrun. Some of the things that slow down these games compared to older Pokemon games include not being able to turn off battle animations, being unable to turn on a battle mode that lets you skip being asked if you want to switch to another party member after every single KO, and only being able to skip specific cutscenes despite there actually being an option to turn them off. Like seriously, why? I don't need to look at this every single time I replay the game. Upon seeing this, many folks avoided this run entirely, as this lack of options was a very jarring change from older Pokemon games and would add a lot of time to the run no matter how you looked at it. It would also mean that any speedrun route of the game would need to find and use Pokemon with short battle animations, avoid having more than one party member as long as possible, and hopefully have an active chat to keep them from being bored from watching those cutscenes. A lot of the initial routing with new Pokemon games usually begins by using starter Pokemon, but none of them ended up sticking very well in the end due to various issues such as slow move animations or not handling certain parts of the game very well, which caused the speedrun route to shift from using Quaquaval, Lucario, Meowscarada, then eventually Hawlucha, before the dust finally settled on Flamigo standing tall as the fastest Pokemon to use for an any percent speedrun. When it comes to why Flamigo is so good, it turned out to have really nice speedrun qualities about it, such as a really high attack stat, really good typing, and a move pool consisting of wing attack, acrobatics, low kick, double kick, and close combat. With how high the attack stat is on Flamigo, it had no problem spamming these low base power moves with incredibly fast move animations for most battles. And to top it off, its ability Scrappy nullifies the effects of the Intimidate ability that's given onto a ton of opponents throughout the story. All speedrunners would have to do now is figure out the best way to travel around the overworld and put together an optimal story path that eventually settled on this. The path being followed on this map lets us take advantage of 5 things along the way. 1, we could prioritize certain Titan Pokemon in the Path of Legends story that gave us really good power-ups for our ride Pokemon along the way and would speed up a lot of the travel. 2, we could mark fly points to help make backtracking to gyms easier. 3, we could earn enough gym badges to make catching Pokemon easier and avoid disobedience from high-level Pokemon that we want to catch later. 4, we could delay the areas that require more than one Pokemon in your party like the Starfall bases and Ghost gyms as long as possible. And 5, we could grab enough EXP candies and rare candies across the map to reach level 80 by the end of the game. I imagine this might sound like a pretty boring speedrun on the surface if all the fights are just fought when you're really over-leveled, but the joy people found from this speedrun came less from the battles that we fought and more from how skilled you were at dodging Pokemon, jumping around obstacles, performing really cool looking tricks, and finally, how fast you could grab XP candies. However, there were 2 final things to break apart outside of story order. What would be the fastest game to play on, and how do you clear the final location, Area 0? The evidence towards figuring out the fastest version of the game heavily leaned towards Pokemon Violet, as Flamigo not only destroyed a bunch of the fights in faster ways compared to Scarlet, but there were also a ton of shortcuts in Area 0 that only worked on Pokemon Violet for some reason. However, those little jet engines on Miraidon actually caused the game to lag so badly that the amount of time you're traveling across the map on Koraidon saves enough time to make Scarlet the faster game to play on. It's really dumb to say that. But what's even dumber is that that's not where the lag ends, unfortunately. Because Area 0 is quite a ridiculous place to travel through. And with how big it is, speedrunners are required to save and reset at least one time throughout the entire game in order to not lose a couple of minutes to just lag alone from traveling there. From what I've been told, this seems to be some sort of memory leak that's never been fixed. And with how longer speedrunners have to keep their game running, it's easy to see why this hampers down their time. But it's hard to really figure out why this is the case for the lag from Team Star bases and their battles. If you've ever done a shiny hunt here or there or interacted with the community, you'll probably know that they often call one of these base locations Lag Tree Thicket. This holds very true to speedruns as well, despite the resets typically occurring before we enter one of those bases. But unfortunately, nothing can help outside of a reset if we see random weather patterns while inside of the Starfall base, causing us to lose a minute because of how the game runs whenever a cloud of rain decides to pour on the base. However, despite all these issues, much of the community members stood strong and competed night and day to see who could be the best. Well, this did last for quite a few months following the route discovery. Eventually, the uphill battle became too much, and the community would need something refreshing to keep the speedrunning scene alive. And what they eventually found were some of the greatest speedrun categories to ever be invented by dividing those 3 monstrous stories into their own little bite-sized speedrun. A lot of the basic routing around these single-story speedruns started by just using Flamigo. As an example, you could clear out the entire Path of Legends speedrun in just under an hour with Flamigo alone. But one massive thing that was looming in the background as this category was coming to life ended up shaping how fun these categories would be, as well as how long speedrunners might end up sticking to playing the any percent category. One important factor I've learned about speedrunning over the years is how important the amount of fun a community will be having when following the rules for a speedrun, which is why I've always been in favor of things like Pokemon speedruns starting after their intro cutscene, or letting people use turbo controllers in order to avoid straining their hands through tedious text mashing. And while there might be a tiny bit of dialogue to mash through or options to pick from in the intro cutscene for Scarlet and Violet, having to sit through the 3 minutes it takes for this cutscene to play out fully just to start another run feels incredibly hollow and meaningless. And I know not everyone will see eye to eye given this is technically part of the game, but with an added 3 minutes of cutscenes at the very beginning, it just makes resets go on for a longer period of time, ruining your flow completely as you're unable to hop back into the action immediately. But Pokemon Scarlet and Violet had an even bigger issue I was hoping the speedrunning community would be willing to look past. That being the 47 minutes it takes to get past the initial tutorial. The fact that it takes this long for the Paldea region to open up to you should be a crime in itself. So when the rules were being voted for, I tried to campaign for skipping a couple of things in the story. Option 1 was just to start from the very beginning of the game and watch the entirety of the cutscene. Option 2 would be to start from the desk. Option 3 would be to start in front of the starter Pokemon, skipping the extremely boring walk inside of the house and straight towards your starter Pokemon. And the final golden goose that I kind of figured wouldn't get accepted would be to skip the entire 47 minutes it takes to get past the initial tutorial. Outside of the starting point of any percent, some of the other things that were voted for were to either allow or ban the use of turbo controllers, if turbo would be the standard way of playing the game, and finally, to figure out where the single story speedrun started and ended. And unfortunately to my dismay, the only part of the game the community was willing to skip for any percent was the intro cutscene, which is why I was incredibly thrilled when for the first time ever, turbo would be the default option and fully allowed in a Pokemon speedrun, alongside single story speedruns being allowed to start after the 47-minute tutorial. And with this vote fully in place, it meant that we could not only reset runs a lot more efficiently and save our hands from hurting during dialogue, but as a bonus factor, any starter Pokemon we use for these single story speedruns would be the exact same one every single time, since the run started from a save file inside of the school after the tutorial. So we're to say reset for one with really good stats and a solid nature, starter Pokemon might actually be able to be used in place of Flamigo to make these short runs even more refreshing. Once speedrunners got wind of this and began resetting for starter Pokemon, Meowscarada ended up being the perfect candidate for a Path of Legends speedrun. Quaquaval fit just right into Starfall Street, and Fuecoco, well, it's good for Victory Road, but only next to Flamigo. Couldn't really change that much, but hey, can't complain when you get a sick 2-for-1 deal to diversify speedruns with a different Pokemon to use in them. And I can't stress enough how much these little categories kept the games alive, because the resets were fast, the runs were fun, and you didn't have to spend 5 hours playing if you really wanted to speedrun Scarlet and Violet. Truly, nothing could go wrong from here. Everything was fantastic until a bit of community drama surrounding turbo controller usage became an issue. You see, the initial reasoning a lot of folks, including myself, wanted turbo controller to be the default option for speedrunning Scarlet and Violet was purely for hand health purposes. Because mashing text in a speedrun that lasts 5 hours long can absolutely destroy your hands and cause permanent damage that even surgery might not be able to fix. And it's also something I don't ever want anyone to experience the way I have. You see, a couple years ago, I decided I wanted to try and see how close I could get to a Pokemon Black and White 1 world record. But not even a month into my grind, I had to completely stop as I was unable to feel part of my middle finger for a week straight because of how aggressive text box are in that game. This was easily one of the most terrifying experiences I've ever had in my life, as Pokemon speedrunning meant everything to me. After all, I've made a career out of it thanks to how much time I put into doing it, and if I had quit because of an injury, I likely wouldn't be writing stories about those experiences for you guys. So the reason why I went into detail on my hand injury at the time was because of the initial idea of allowing Turbo Controller in Scarlet and Violet being centered around hand health during speedruns. Since a lot of folks who had done speedruns for years tried these controllers for the first time, it was like a match made in heaven. But to make things fair for those who didn't want to move over to Turbo, a push to make it so that holding a single button would be the norm, as holding a single button is slower than the speeds a human can reach by mashing normally. Where the problems came in was when Turbo users started to adopt using Turbo on a single button alongside using their fingers to mash other buttons, completely defeating the purpose of the original idea surrounding the vote. Now, I need to preface that mashing while using Turbo was not voted against, as the only thing that was voted in was allowing Turbo in the first place. The mashing with a single button part was purely a gentleman's agreement that unfortunately got pretty heated within the community, as not many people could see eye to eye on what should and shouldn't be allowed with Turbo. Words like cheater were thrown around when they probably shouldn't have been, and it eventually got to the point where people just started doing runs in ways that they wanted to do them. This made competing at the time incredibly toxic, because what if this person was doing Turbo plus mashing all along? What if that person started turboing more than one button at a time? Who could you even trust anymore? And because of this discourse, more and more votes were being put together to have a definitive rule set, which is an extremely exhausting process for both the people involved in voting and people who are making those polls to vote on in the first place. It all takes time, and the longer it takes, the more discourse can happen. In fact, someone ended up getting suspended from the speedrunning community for a while because of all this drama. And while they did eventually get unbanned and everything was settled by a vote, the Scarlet and Violet speedrunning community was kinda left in shambles after all the drama, causing many of the community members to move on to other games. Not even this insane glitch that let you fly at super speeds across the map could reignite people's passions. So it'd be a few months before the community was able to bounce back and unite under the interest of speedrunning Scarlet and Violet yet again. On September 13th of 2023, Scarlet and Violet released its first ever DLC, opening the world of Scarlet and Violet to a brand new region filled with such a beautiful atmosphere and an adorable mascot legendary for everyone to fall in love with. But more importantly, it gave speedrunners a reason to come back to Scarlet and Violet speedruns to figure out how to beat the DLC as fast as possible. The single story timing for Scarlet and Violet speedruns ended up being the perfect way to enjoy a teal mask DLC speedrun, as we could actually jump straight into the DLC as soon as we beat the school tutorial. And to make it even more refreshing, the DLC and battles were filled with a lot of Pokemon that made Flamigo feel a lot less valuable for a speedrun. With how the story goes, you'll face main characters Carmine and Kieran in a bunch of battles that you can actually lose on purpose. Where it gets weird is when you meet the DLC mascot Ogerpon, have to deal with Kieran's Joker phase after gaslighting him and beating him in battles over and over again, then are forced to work with his sister Carmine to stop this evil trio of legends from ruining Kitakami. And oh my goodness, is she the most useless doubles partner I've ever seen. Because not only does she pop up text every time something weird happens, but her leading Morpeko is one of the worst things ever for a speedrun, since it turns into its new form every single turn it's on the field. But more importantly, it doesn't do much against the legendary villains who are sporting poison types, which gave a huge edge to Pokemon like Medicham to overtake the throne in place of Flamigo, and reaching times around 1 hour and 40 minutes to clear the DLC, proving once again that short accessible categories like this one could bring new life to Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. However, the DLC came with a huge price when it was first released. And I'm not talking about the price tag of the DLC itself. I'm talking about issues that could ruin an any percent speedrun 3 hours into playing. For the folks who had stuck with speedrunning the game since release, none of the underlying issues holding back Scarlet and Violet ever got fixed. And just like the stubborn folks we are, we held out for 10 months straight in hopes that a performance patch would come with the DLC. But when a Pokemon speedrunner that goes by Corolio went into the poison base, this happened.
終了位置をロードの長さと誤認した可能性もあるけど。あ、来た。
That right there is not a normal thing, as load should only last seconds. But here we are, speedrunning a game almost 2 years after release with no known way around this random poison-based load. To top it off, there was a glitch near the credits that could have possibly ruined a catch 'em all speedrun by crashing your game on the final fight. Seeing all this, it was hard not to just give up on the any percent category altogether, as we'd already held out hope for so long only to be constantly punished. So after a bit of competing and creating new categories like doing the entire story and the DLC, things became pretty dormant fairly quickly, as we figured the next best chance at actually being able to speedrun the game properly would be if they could bring it all back with the final DLC patch releasing in 3 months. On December 13th of 2023, the Indigo Disc DLC came out, along with another small update called Mochi Mayhem. This gave the game a crazy amount of extra content, and alongside it, yet another speedrun category. But the things that you have to do in order to actually unlock the Indigo Disc is pretty ridiculous. To start, you have to beat the Path to Legend story, Starfall Street, Victory Road, get past the credits, beat the Teal Mask DLC, and then, and only then, can you finally step into the Indigo Disc. But once you do get past all this 7 hours of content, the speedrun becomes pretty unique with how much focus the DLC puts into double battles. While we do use Flamigo for the main power source of this run, it still needs a partner to do those double battles with, making it so that you have to actually venture around and find a bunch of double battle partners if you want to be able to progress through the story. So far, the best candidates seem to be Koraidon for its broken ability and moves, Halucha because it's a discount Flamigo, Alolan Dugtrio for its spread ground moves and iron moves, and finally, Meowstick who has access to Fake Out. And if you don't know how good Fake Out is, you should really start watching the official competitive format of Pokemon. Outside of the double battles, there also happens to be a lot of single battles that get absolutely obliterated by Flamigo since it's been gaining experience the entire time, eventually reaching level 98 on the final battle against Terapagos. It only takes about 2 hours to get through that entire story. If we then add all the content from the Mochi Mayhem update that throws even more double battles at you just to get a mythical Pokemon, the entire run adds up to be about a 10-hour speedrun. Now, while I personally enjoy super long runs as much as the next person, speedrunning this much Scarlet and Violet is a lot when the game was still extremely unoptimized at this point. But oddly enough, there was a small, unexpected fix to the lag that ran the game fast enough to where the first ever sub 5 hour and 20-minute speedrun of Scarlet and Violet any percent was finally achieved. By a pure twist of fate, the one who got the first sub 520 was a person filled with a bit too much passion for how turbo should be implemented on the leaderboards. Their passion was so strong that for 1 entire year straight, this person stuck with only using single button turbo mashing and refused to mash manually at all while turbo was on. You likely know them as the Legends Arceus world record holder Halqery. And what I haven't told you is that they were the ones who initially got suspended from the community. Now, I want to be forward that any grievances that happened between Halqery and the other community members have been settled since then. And Halqery himself has grown quite a bit in the last 2 years, constantly helping the community get better at speedrunning and willing to listen to the other side of a community argument even if they don't always agree with it. This takes a lot for a person to do, and I think that they deserve a lot of respect for it. And as a reward from the universe, once they finally gave in and settled for playing the way the community wanted, they saw success almost immediately and got a world record so good that it might just be unbeatable on the current patch of the game. The reason why is that the RNG from this run was so insane, as he got the most ridiculous Flamigo I've ever seen,
Holy sh!
dodged all the nasty RNG that could have possibly hampered his run.
Okay, here we go. This is it. Go through. Okay, cool.
And just played like an absolute legend while crossing all the points on the map at just the right time for one of the most optimized patches we've ever seen in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. Because as per usual with Scarlet and Violet, one of the recent patches took the game one step forward and a bunch of steps back. to the point where we have to save and reset the run twice instead of just once to save time from lag, leaving it in a state where competing feels a bit pointless for any percent. But where exactly does this leave Pokemon Scarlet and Violet as a whole? And can we truly say that speedrunners gave up on it? Well, as I look over at speedrun.com/Pokemon, it mentions there are 9 active players in Scarlet and Violet out of the 98 that have submitted runs. But after a quick skim, there are about 5 runs that have been submitted and completed within the last 2 months, with the other 4 having been done back in the summer of 2024. And if I want to be proper with my critique, I don't think I can entirely say they've completely given up. However, the game as a speedrun is pretty much on life support. Right now, the only active categories are the single story runs, the Teal Mask run, and surprisingly a Catch-em-all speedrun, as well as an Indigo Disc and Mochi Mayhem speedrun. However, you might have noticed the lack of an any percent speedrun mentioned here. A speedrun category that is very much the central glue that usually keeps a speedrun scene alive. But with an any percent world record this good on a patch that's no longer able to be played on, alongside many of the issues never being addressed with a patch, makes it hard for even the most stubborn people in the world to want to compete. And every time speedrunners were stubborn enough to hold out for hope, we got punished instantly for the last 2 years straight. Seeing the Scarlet and Violet speedrunning scene in the shape that it is now makes me truly sad to witness, as I honestly think the game deserves so much better than the treatment it got with how fun the runs are when none of these issues plague your speedrun. If I can give only one final hope for the game to come back to relevancy, 3 things likely need to happen. First, the leaderboards need to be split between game versions in order for Violet to have a bit of competition. I think we'd also need to split up each run submitted to reflect the patch the game was played on. That way folks gunning for the 80% record actually have a chance at beating it. And finally, we gotta hope that the Nintendo Switch's successor plays Pokemon Scarlet and Violet a lot smoother than the original one. While these things aren't exactly a guaranteed way of getting people to speedrun it again, and would require a drive from the community that currently isn't very strong at the moment, it's at least my hope that there might be a way to pull Scarlet and Violet off of life support one day. But until then, please go give a follow to the amazing folks who are still running this game to this day. And I hope you all enjoyed this walk through Scarlet and Violet speedrun history. Subscribe if you want more, and thanks for watching.